So can everybody see my screen now?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
let me put it on presentation mode.
Good.
Okay, so can everybody see it in presentation mode now?
Yeah, we can.
Yes, sir. We can, sir.
Okay. So just like I said, fraud itself, it's a very broad topic. So given the limited time, we'll just have to scope it, to talk about aspects, that, really concern us, as a Nigeria.
Sorry, sir. Hello, sir.
Hello?
Yeah. Please, can we get the presentation after this thing, or should we jot in something?
Definitely.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Obviously, with a limited time, I may need to gloss over some things. So by the time you have the presentation, you have time, to digest them as properly.
Okay, thank you, sir.
For the purpose of our discussion, we'll be talking about facts, about fraud, examples of fraud types, both within the global perspective and also within the Nigerian perspective, especially within the financial institution. Then countermeasures or controls, to mitigate fraud. The unfortunate thing is that fraud cannot be totally eliminated, Otherwise, people like us that are into information security, the EFCC or ICPC, will have nothing to do. But what is important is to continue, to innovate strategies, to ensure that it can be mitigated, at least to the barest minimum. Then finally, we'll talk about data or information security as control against fraud. Because like I keep on telling people, at the core of fraud, lies data. The more a fraudster, has access to sensitive information, the more successful, that fraudster, becomes. So it's very important to recognize data as a very important element when it comes to information security, when it comes to fraud. And as such, we should have ways, or we should be vast with ways of managing data effectively. So facts about fraud. Fraud is pervasive, in most societies and in organizations, either at a family level, at an organizational level, or even at a national level. At the family level, the possibility exists, that wives, defraud their husband, husbands defraud their wives, children defraud, their parents, and all that. Any action that involves trying to deceive somebody, for financial gain or other, personal selfish gain, is tantamount to fraud. So it exists in every strata of the society. Then also, fraud portends negative impacts on the victim. I have never seen any individual that is a victim of fraud and he or she, is happy about it. There are always, dire consequences, especially, to the victim of fraud. So it's really very important, to understand this. Wherever fraud is successful, there is always a loss, on the victim side, either in terms of finances, or either, in terms of, status and the likes. Then preventing fraud and other economic crime is a complex challenge. Like I mentioned before, if it were to be easy to completely eliminate as a fraud, then people like us in information security, cybersecurity, the EFCC, ICPC, and the likes, will not, be in business, because fraudsters, keep innovating ways, of defrauding people. Case in point, there's a new fraud now going on within the country, where, for example, you go onto Gigi, to buy a particular item. This item unknowingly may have been posted by a fraudster. So on signaling to purchase this item, based on pay on delivery, you see the, the fraudster now order this same item, from an original as a seller, sends it to the address of the original buyer through a dispatch as a rider. Once the dispatch rider, gets to the original as in buyer, the original buyer calls the number of the fraudster, to make payment for this item. At the same time, the dispatch rider will call the original seller of this item, confirming whether he or she has received the amount, paid for this item. And unfortunately, by the time this call is, put across, the original seller, denies receiving any payment, from the original buyer of this item. Remember that the original buyer of this item only has the details of the, as in fraudster. So at the end of the day, this item is not released, to the original buyer, and the original buyer, is defrauded. So this is a new way of, defrauding that is really very, common, within the as in country. So this is also categorized under triangulation fraud, which we will also, talk about in due course of this, presentation. So, according to PricewaterhouseCoopers, 46% of surveyed organizations from 53 different countries reported experiencing fraud. Like I said before, this shows that it is not something that is only common, within the country. You have it, everywhere, within the world. And I keep arguing that, yes, Nigeria may be notorious, for scams and frauds, but I can tell you that even the advanced clients, they experience more fraud, than developing countries, such as in Nigeria. Although this is not, the time, to continue to argue about that. But the point here is just that fraud happens across the world, regardless of the client, where this fraud, is being perpetrated. Then lastly, effective data information management is at the core of every fraud management. So it is very important, to recognize data as a core element, of fraud. And as such, it is very important, to know ways or have strategies, to ensure effective data management. So examples of contemporary fraud from the global perspective. We have what is called the friendly fraud, which accounts for as much as 70% of all credit card fraud, according to a 2020 report, by FIS Global. I don't know the name we have for that in Nigeria here, but as far as the world is concerned, this is the #1 type of fraud that is experienced, especially by financial institutions and also entities, that involved, in e-commerce. So friendly fraud occurs whenever a criminal purchases something, with his or her credit card, and at the same time, disputes a charge and request for a chargeback, to that as in credit card. So finally, the this fraudster gets the item as in purchased, but still tries as much as possible to get a chargeback, from his or her bank. Then the second one is called account takeover. So this usually happens when a fraudster or a hacker uses a stolen username and password, to take over an account, of the authentic owner of that account. So this username and password, can either be stolen, can either be as in purchased, from hackers, or some of them, may even be gotten through actions, such as phishing and farming. Then when it comes to phishing, farming, whaling, this are similar ways of defrauding, although they have some subtle differences, and I'll quickly explain that. When it comes to phishing, phishing is usually actualized, when a perpetrator or a fraudster sends an email, to an unsuspecting as a user, trying to lure that user to a spoofed as in website, with the hope of, getting sensitive data, from, the as a user. I'm sure so many of us, may have also, have witnessed this, where emails are sent, and you will be expected, to, put your sensitive information, such as information on your credit card, on this site, with an attempt of acquiring this information. Then farming. Farming is similar to phishing, and phishing can lead to farming. But the subtle difference is that instead of you being sent a link via email, usually email is, of course, email is sent to you too. But on clicking on the mail, instead of the mail taking you to a spoofed as a site, a malicious code is automatically downloaded onto your system. And once this malicious code is downloaded onto your system, it can always, you know, in the future, you know, direct you to a spoof site, you know, with the aim of getting you to release your confidential information. Whaling doesn't really require any sophisticated technical as a methodology. Whaling most times, you know, requires the understanding of human psychology, you know, by the as a fraudster, and this is usually targeted, you know, at executives. Okay, what they usually do is to send you a mail, you know, using lexicons, you know, within the business industry to try as much as possible, you know, to lure executives, you know, into spoofed sites where they obtain, you know, their information. Then identity thefts usually occurs whenever a fraudster or a hacker steals the identity of the authorized owner of that identity. For example, you know, your personal identifiable information, you know, such as your name, such as your email, your address, and all that. So once those information is stolen, a fraudster, you know, can use that information, you know, for his or her own financial gain or other gains. The money laundering, I don't really need to talk too much about this, since the audience we have here constitutes, you know, bankers and, you know, financial as in personnel. I think this is straightforward. You know, money laundering is just a way of trying to, you know, wash, you know, dirty as money to make it appear as if it's as a legitimate as a money. Then triangulation fraud is the one that I described earlier, you know, involving unsuspecting buyers, you know, trying to buy things on e-commerce site, you know, such as GG and the likes. Then reshipping fraud. This is prevalent among our boys. And when I say our boys, the so-called Yahoo boys. So they do this a lot. So what they do is to use stolen credit cards, you know, to purchase high value items such as computers, cars, and send it, you know, to reshipping mules. So these reshipping mules are hired, okay, to reship these items, you know, to Nigeria. Then finally, inflated procurement contracts. This is also, you know, prevalent, you know, within the as in public as in sector, where prices or costs, you know, for contract, you know, are inflated. For example, a contract that shouldn't cost as more than 10 million is advertised, you know, for 20 million naira. And at the end of the day, members within the government organization, you know, seeks to get as a kickback, you know, from the contractor that eventually gets the contract. So what you're just seeing here is some sort of statistics. You know, this also is from PricewaterhouseCoopers, and what you have here is some sort of rating for trending fraud methodology. So as you can see here, number one on the list, just like I mentioned earlier, is friendly fraud. In 2019, it was rated 5th, but by 2021, it rose to number 1 as the most, you know, notorious methodology, you know, for defrauding organizations. Then card testing. Card testing is just the way where fraudsters try to validate the authenticity, you know, of either a credit card or a debit card. So once they do that and they see that, you know, the card is actually authentic, then they can now use this card, you know, to purchase all sorts of items and services, you know, on the websites or e-commerce as in platforms. So you can go over this because I don't want to spend too much time on this. I know we've spent about 15 minutes now. So financial institution related fraud. So these are the basic types of fraud that are prevalent, you know, within our financial institution. So there are so many of them. So do not consider this as an exhaustive as a list. So for the first one, clearing fraud. So this is usually an act of stealing, you know, or depriving, duping, or exploiting an individual, organization, or group of institutions, you know, through criminal manipulation of clearing instruments. So the clearing fraud takes the following forms. It can come in the form of suppression of clearing instruments. It can also come in the form of payment against unclear effects. It can also come in the form of conversion of clearing instruments. Then you have a letter of credit fraud, which is usually an undertaking by an issuing bank on behalf of an importer, which is usually the applicant, that payment, will be made for goods or services, supplied by the exporter, which is also the beneficiary. Then provided that the exporter complies with all the terms and conditions, stipulated by this as in credit. So this letter of credit, usually passes through many confirmation stages, through which a fraudulent banker, can manipulate and defraud the bank or the exporter. So usually the common practice is that some beneficiaries to the credits use forged or fraudulent documents, to perpetrate, this fraudulent activity. Then executive fraud, as the name implies, this is usually a fraud within the financial sector, that is perpetrated, by executives. So this is usually characterized, by the following tentacles, such as loan application through fronts, foreign exchange transfer, profiteering. I know of a particular bank manager then in 2017. This particular guy struggled to build his house. I think he had a budget of about 400,000 naira per month to build a house. At the beginning of 2018, this particular bank manager was not only able to finish the house, but the bedroom alone, costs 8 million as a naira. Okay, so within that period of 2017, where there was a serious gap, between the foreign exchange rates in the black as a market and, within CBN, he was able to make so much money, as in from that. So that is also a form of executive as in fraud. Then granting of unauthorized as in loans. This is also a common fraud, within the banking sector, where individuals, with the authority to grant loans, usually do it without getting, higher authorities. So posting of fictitious as in credits, this is also very prevalent, within the banking sector, where what is posted, is totally different from what, the customer has deposited. Then fraudulent transfers and withdrawals, that is also very common. Employee aided armed robbery. This is also very, 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 very common. Like they say, where I come from, the insects that eats or destroys the vegetable usually lies within as a vegetable. So, you may be surprised that majority of, this armed robbery, either armed robbery, within the bank or bank robbery that involves as in customers, are usually aided, by staff of such as in banks. Then you also, debit credit card fraud is also very, very, very common. In fact, earlier as in this year, I personally experienced as in that too, where I just noticed that almost about 60,000 naira was debited, from my credit card, and my credit card, was with me, the whole time, this happens. Then website spoofing, just like I mentioned before, website spoofing is a way fraudsters usually clone sites, with the hope and aim of deceiving unsuspecting users on the net. Then also identity theft, I think I've also mentioned this, so I won't spend too much time talking about this here. Then identifying main perpetrators of fraud. In order to be effective, at fraud management, it is very, very important to be able to identify the classes of perpetrators, of fraud. And from what we have here, there are two types of perpetrators. You have the external perpetrator, and you also have the internal perpetrator. And you also have a collusion, between the internal and external perpetrators. But between this external and internal perpetrator, I will advise that you focus more on the internal perpetrators. In fact, internal perpetrators are referred, to as insider as in threats. Before I continue, I want to do a sound check. Can you still hear me? Just to be sure that I'm not talking to myself.
Yes,
sir.
I can hear
Yes,
you.
sir.
Yeah,
We can
yes, we
hear you
can.
loud and clear.
Thank you very much for that, Azufin.
All right. All right.
So it's very important that part of the strategy to effectively manage fraud, should focus on the management of staff, within an organization. So although according to PricewaterhouseCoopers, they are saying that there had been increase, by 43% in external perpetrators, within the year 2020. But regardless, most of this fraud are being perpetrated or are being aided, are being facilitated, by insiders, within the organization. And as such, it's very important that focus, is given. So to underscore the last slide, this is an excerpt from a CBN report, between 2002 and 2006, showing that about 1,283 staff, within the banking industry were actually indicted, for, fraudulent activities. And as you can see, that at the top are the executives, that is the supervisors and the managers. And the lists category in this table, are the temporary staff. This underscores that really when one talks about fraud, especially within the financial industry, focus and care, should be given. Care, attention should be given to the staff. So fraud prevention and mitigation strategy. So in order to properly manage fraud, like I mentioned earlier, one cannot totally eliminate the occurrence of fraud. What we can do is just to try as much as possible to manage it. So in order for any organization to effectively manage fraud or prevent fraud, the following are advised. Number one, enforcement of government as in statutes. There are so many government statutes that are out there, to control, the activities of fraudsters. So it is very important that organizations, try to comply with them. And we'll see this or some of this government statutes, in the course of this presentation. Then also information security technical controls. These are also very important. And this speaks more, to the IT personnel, within the financial industry. Then information security administrative controls, that is also very important. Then information security physical controls. So we'll see each of this in detail in the following slide. So effective enforcement of government statutes. There are so many of these government statutes out there. But the problem we're having, is the effective, enforcement, of all this as a statute. So these are examples of them. Number one, companies and allied matters, decrees that, created the CAC. We have the bank employees, declaration of assets, so that at the end of an employee tenure, within, the bank, the assets after his or employment, can be compared with the assets, before gaining that employment in the first place. Then we have the one, for also LEE, then the special tribunal. Then we also have the Central Bank of Nigeria decree, which establishes, central bank. Then we also have this risk-based cybersecurity framework and policy guidelines. I think this was issued sometimes in June 29th, as in this year, to other financial institutions. And this is just to provide some sort of guideline to ensure that their cybersecurity implementation, is risk as in based. So you have others. Then also you have the Nigerian Data Protection as a regulation, which also provides requirements, guidelines, to ensure that the privacy of owners of personally identifiable information are protected. Then you also have the Cybercrime as an Act 2015, which also provides requirements to ensure that cybercrime and strategies are effectively implemented by organizations. So that is one strategy. The number two strategy, like I mentioned earlier, are technical controls, and this speak more to the IT personnel within the financial industry. So technical controls include as in firewall, which are devices that, that manages access control in and out of the information system, of financial institutions. Then also intrusion prevention detection system. It's similar to a firewall. It's just that it uses more of heuristics, to determine who has access into an organization's information as a system or as a network. Then there are also a myriad of fraud detection as a systems and softwares, that can be deployed that will not only help detect as in fraud, but can also help predict the possibility of fraud, occurring within an organization that's in system. But obviously, anti-malware, it's very, very important because some of this fraud are being perpetrated, through the infestation of malware, within the computers of these organizations or their servers and the like. So it's very important, as simple as it sounds, it's very important that an effective anti-malware is deployed. Then multi-factor authentication system. Yes, I know this is being implemented by as most banks, although there is still one bank that still allows its old mobile app to still connect. And that old mobile app, does not support a multi-factor authentication. So multi-factor authentication simply means using what you have and what you know to have access to your resources. As simple as that. Things like, OTP, there are examples of using multi-factor authentication, to access your resources online. Then encryption, using secure socket layer and transport layer. So it's also very, very, very important. We should ensure that every data, either data at rest, data in transit, is always encrypted. Then password complexity enforcement. It's also very important. So we expect that all banking applications, either the ones being used within the banking sector or the ones facing their customer, should enforce password complexity. None of these applications, should allow the use of simple applications. For example, IO123, because those simple passwords, can easily be hacked, by a hacker that intends, to defraud the, users. Then authentication, validation, authorization should be part of any security application implemented, within the financial industry. Then data backups is very important because defrauding also involves deletion of sensitive data. But if this sensitive data are properly as in backed up, then that becomes, difficult for fraudsters, to perpetrate. Disaster recovery site, it's also very important. This is a case, where you have some sort of backup site, to ensure that when your primary systems, information system doesn't fail, it can easily fail over, to this disaster recovery site. Then artificial intelligence, okay, is what is pervasive now in advanced clients. And I think that our banking application should infuse this, because the beauty about artificial intelligence is that it goes through the system and not only help to detect as a fraud, but can also implement what is called predictive modeling to predict the possible occurrence of fraud, so that administrators, can immediately put in measures to ensure that fraud, does not happen on their information system. Then blockchain also, in fact, as far as I'm concerned, blockchain will take over the banking industry in the near as in future. So blockchain is just a technology that uses decentralized as a ledger, to record transactions. And the point here is that blockchain technology is immutable, meaning that nothing can be deleted. Okay, so the good news with that is that if any entity tries to perform fraud on a blockchain as a system, there is always an audit trail, to ensure that this is detected. Now we move to administrative control. So while technical controls are very important, administrative controls are also very, very important. So this just involves measures that focuses on policies, processes, practices, and principles, to be put into place to ensure that fraud is prevented or at, the worst case, mitigated. So this includes adoption of information security, cybersecurity standards. And these are global standards that provide requirements, to ensure that the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data are preserved. And if that can be achieved, then definitely fraud will be mitigated. Then also implementation of information security, cybersecurity management system. So this is just a management system to help manage information security or cybersecurity as a standard. And we'll see that in detail, in due course of this presentation. Then staff training, awareness, and sensitization. It is very, very important. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, this is even more important than the technical controls, because in any security implementation, the staff are always, or shall I say, an untrained staff is always the weakest link. So it's very important that regular and continuous training on information security, fraud management is conducted. And also, in addition to the staff, it's also very important that this training should also be extended to stakeholders. And part of the stakeholders are customers of this financial industry. Customers of the banks, they also need to be trained. There should be awareness, to know what to look out for in order to prevent them from being a victim of fraud. Then staff continuous background checks. This is also very important. In fact, as part of the implementation of any information security standard, it is a requirement that you do continuous background check on your staff, just to ensure that they are not trying to implement anything that is nefarious, within the system. Then business process management is also very important. It's important that you identify all the processes within your organization, optimize this as in processes, and try as much as possible to automate them. The more processes you can account for, the more likely you may be able to prevent the occurrence of fraud within your organization. The manual review of transactions and fraud detection systems. Yes, while we have applications that can help manage fraud, it is also very, very important to ensure that time is dedicated to ensure that the transactions being generated by this system are constantly reviewed, either on a monthly basis or on a quarterly basis. And when I say manual review, somebody in person should be there to review these transactions. Like I mentioned earlier, all these fraudsters, they are coming up with innovative ways. In fact, some of them are information security experts. They are certified, just to ensure that they can easily, gain as in the system. So it's very important that all the systems are continuously and constantly, being monitored and reviewed, by systems administrators, within the banks. Then manual review of privileged access accounts and system event logs. Okay, so what this advises is that for any system administrator within a bank, for example, that manages sensitive applications, such as databases, Finacle application, usually they have privileged accounts, administrator accounts. So there should be some sort of security governing body that constantly review the use of these accounts, just to ensure that these accounts are continually being used, for the purpose that they are meant for. Then risk management is also very, very, very important. And that is part of what the CBN's latest guideline, is also, trying to preach. Risk management is at the core of any data security, information security implementation. It is at the core of any, type of fraud as a management, as a strategy. So it's very important that this is implemented. So what does risk management entails? Identify your information assets, identify the risks that can affect them, do some sort of business impact analysis, and provide risk treatment, to ensure that this risk do not graduate, into incidents. Then business impact analysis, just like I mentioned earlier, it's very important. After your risk management, also see how this risk, measure how this risk, can impact on the outcomes or the goals and objectives of your organization. And also have what is called a business continuity plan in place. This is also very important to ensure that whenever a disaster, such as fraud, strikes, there are plans, for resilience, for the organization. So this is also very important. Then also classification of information. It's very important. Any information within your organization or data should be classified, okay? Classification, for example, can be public, documents that, that can be public, documents that are top secret, documents that are secret, or information that are restricted. So this will help you also identify the entities that can have access, to such information. Then physical controls. This is also very important. So for example, ensure that for all your documents, physical documents, they are in a fireproof cabinet. Then physically secure your data centers. Because the surprising thing is that for most of these information systems, especially servers, username and password are not enough to protect them. There are ways of bypassing all these things. So that is why it is also very important to ensure that in addition to having a username and password on these systems, you also physically protect them, even if it means locking them up, with as in padlock. If you cannot get access to them physically, then it's going to be very difficult, circumventing, any sort of software-based security on these systems. Then physically secure your data center, CCTV cameras, and also ensure that you have trained security guards in place. How many minutes more do I have, please? I think I'm running out of time, right?
Go ahead, sir. No, sir.
Okay, I'm still good. Thank you very much, because we still have about 5 slides to cover here. So finally, the final section for this presentation will talk more on information security management system. All the strategies that I talked about earlier can be implemented in one breath by having an effective information security management system in place. So this is just a system to ensure that all this strategy are implemented in one as in breath. So ISMS is a management system, set up to implement information security. And before you can even implement an information security management system, it's also very important for you to understand what information security is. And from what we have here, information security just protects sensitive information from unauthorized activities or persons. It also helps ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information owned either by an individual or organization. So if you can effectively protect your information, then you will have also, been able to effectively manage any possibility of fraud. Sorry. So what are the strategies for information security management? Before you implement any information security management, the very first thing is to ensure that you secure the approval of top management or their buying. It's very important because without the approval, then it may be very difficult for you to implement any form of ISMS. Then create an information security objective. Before any ISMS is implemented, there should be objective. For example, if your objective is fraud management, then it has to be defined so that all your actions regarding the information security management system focuses on fraud as a management. Then also identify information that are vulnerable to be used for the purpose of fraud. For example, sensitive information belonging to your customers. So this should be identified. And every vulnerability within this information should also be identified and properly managed. Then identify information assets that hold and manage these assets. Like I mentioned earlier, our servers, applications, these are information assets, that hold this information. So it is very important that we identify them. Then identify and adopt an information security standard. There are so many standards for information security or cybersecurity. And the most popular one is the ISO 27001. Okay? And you can also certify your organization on these standards, if required. Then create an information security management system team. For an information security management system to be implemented, there should be a team. The team should be constituted, by information security managers, auditors, that ensures that constant audit is conducted on the system. Then implementers, to ensure that any gaps identified are effectively implemented. There are risk managers that continuously helps to manage the risk within the environment, and also information security compliance officers that ensure on a daily basis that compliance, is achieved on this information security. Then create an information security policy. So these are just policies that provides all the requirements, to ensure effective information security. Then train staff on information security, implement risk management, conduct regular internal and external audits. Audits, I cannot overemphasize this. For you to ensure effective fraud management, you must conduct regular audits, both internal audits and external audits, so that they monitor and evaluate the performance of your information security management system. So it's not enough for you to just have this system in place, but it's also very important that you continue to monitor and evaluate. Okay, try to see whether the system that has been implemented is meeting the objective. For example, is it meeting the objective of effective fraud as management? So this has to be done, to ensure that the system is performing. Then finally, it's always very important, to engage in continuous improvement. Like they say, the biggest room in the world is the room for improvement. So you should also put in strategy, to ensure that, this is done. So these are examples of information security and risk management standards. You have the ISO 27001, which is an international standard. You have the ISO 31000, which is on risk management. It's also an international standard. Then you have the NIST. NIST is more like an American national standard. Then you also have the FIPS, that is the Federal Information Processing Standard. It's also a US national standard. Then you have the PCI DSS, which is prevalent, within the banking and financial
I think we lost him. Let's wait for a minute for him to come back, please. Yeah, sorry about that, please. Delegates is trying to join in again, please. All right, we have him back. Sir, please. We lost you for some minutes.
Okay, yeah, so I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. My system was still connected, but I discovered that I have been disconnected. Did you hear me up to the point where I finished the presentation? Hello?
Yes, yes, sir.
No, no,
You were
I didn't hear you.
You were trying to read the last information security.
Okay, as what I'm going to do now, let me go back to the slide, and you tell me where exactly you lost my connection. Hold on.
All right, sir.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can, sir. I can.
Okay.
Yes,
Did I get to this point?
Yes,
Yes,
that
sir.
this is where you stop.
This is where you, yes.
Oh, okay, yeah. This is practically the last slide. So
Okay.
let me just, go over, this just shows examples of information security and risk management standards, So, like I mentioned, you have the ISO 27001. It's an international information security standard. You also have the ISO 31000, which is an international risk management standard. You have the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is a national standard, within the US. You also have the Federal Information Processing Standard, which is also a national standard within the US. Then finally, you have the PCI DSS, which is the Payment Card Industry Standard, Data Security Standards Industry, which is very prevalent, within the banking industry. So that marks the end of the presentation. Like I mentioned earlier, before I was cut off, if you have questions, comments, this will be the right time, to push them forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you so much for that insightful presentation. And the next on the agenda is question and answer interaction. I can see some hands up already. We have Clement Babalola. Hold on. In case you want to ask question, you can also use the chat box to write your questions, and we'll definitely pick it up from there and read it out for the faculty. Please, Clemens, please, can you unmute yourself?
Okay. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Yeah, that's it. A very nice presentation. Well done, sir. I have a question and a worry actually. It's about card fraud in the banking sectors.
Sorry, Clement, please. Can you please introduce yourself?
Okay, my name is Clement Babalola. I work for Keystone Bank, Lagos. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. There was a disturbing scenario, and what really happened was that some group of fraudsters actually used one of the terminal of a fintech. On that terminal, I think they have some algorithm they used to randomly generated card pan. Even though the failure rate was very high, but they were still able to get some card pan to be used. So with that card pan and CVV, they were able to defraud some customer some huge amount of money. So in such a scenario, what can the bank do? Knowing that we have this this so-called fintech now springing up everywhere in the country. So the information came to the bank system as a legal information, because the PAN, the CV were correct, and the transaction were able to succeed. So what can the bank do to prevent this kind of fraud?
Thank you very much, Mr. Babalola, for that, as in concern. And it's indeed a very disturbing as in concern. For me, I think there are two fronts, to try to mitigate this kind of incident. Number one is that current CBN regulation on fintechs must be strengthened. Okay? The thing is that we cannot run away from the activities of fintechs. Why? Because they are really helping, especially when it comes to the ease of financial transaction and also the ease of inclusion of those within the underserved and unserved areas of the country. So no doubts about that, we cannot do without them. But at the same time, we should be able to have them around, operating in a secure manner. So CBN has to do more in enforcing strict measures to ensure that the fintechs are properly regulated. Then number two, on the bank's part, any interface of connection with this fintechs should be properly audited. In fact, the risk management should be conducted to see areas of vulnerability, okay, and to see ways of remediating this vulnerability. Because for them to be successful, okay, with the ATMs means that there's a particular vulnerability, and it may be a new type of vulnerability. And that is why I mentioned, earlier in my presentation, that anything you are doing as a strategy must be continuous. If you are conducting risk management, it has to be conducted on a regular basis. If you are conducting training on data security, it has to be done on a continuous basis. That is the only way, you can keep up with the activities of this as a fraudster. Like I mentioned, this kind of incidents cannot be eliminated, but we should try as much as possible to continuously put in strategies to mitigate the activities of this fraudsters. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. We have to keep to time. We have a question in the chat box, sir, for you.
Oh, okay.
Let me read it out for you, sir.
Can you help me read it out? Thank you.
This is from Michael. Michael is from, okay. It says, sir, kindly throw more light on the triangulation fraud.
Okay, yes. Let me talk more on that. Triangulation fraud, from the name, implies that there are three major entities involved in this fraud: the original buyer, the original seller, and the fake seller or fraudster. There are two examples of this triangulation. The very first one, I gave it earlier. Another one is the case where you go on all these e-commerce sites. You see an item, you pay for this item. Normally, you expect the seller, because most of these e-commerce sites, majority of the items sold there are actually sold by independent sellers. So normally, you expect that the seller should ship the item to you. But instead of the seller doing that, what the seller does, because the seller is a fraudster, uses a stolen debit card or credit card to purchase the same item from a totally different site and ships it to you, the original buyer. You, the original buyer, receives this item. This same fake seller now perpetrates what is called friendly fraud. Now calls the bank and claims that a charge was made on his card, that an authorized charge was made on the card, and forces or compels the bank to do a chargeback to the card. So in this case now, there are usually two losers here: the owner of the stolen credit card and also the bank, if the bank eventually, or if the bank regulator eventually compels the bank to return the money to that card. So that is on one side. Then the other one is the one that I mentioned earlier, where, for example, you go on GG, you see an item that you like, you now purchase, but your purchase is based on pay on delivery. Meanwhile, you as the original buyer, you've been talking to a fraudster. So what that fraudster does on the same GG, for example, I'm just using GG as an example. It happens on other e-commerce sites within the country. So this perpetrator or the fraudster now orders for the same item from an original seller. The original seller now sends it, for example, through a dispatch rider to deliver this item.